In the early 1940s, Brazil's vast diversity of peoples was largely unknown to the outside world. This was partially true even for many Brazilians living in coastal cities. Getulio Vargas, a benign but strong-willed dictator, governed Brazil under strict rule. Elections and civil rights were suspended, and the police kept people in line with threats of brutality. Meanwhile, Vargas's propagandists depicted a country of contented, hard-working people, but this image sugarcoated the poverty of much of the population, especially in rural areas. The outbreak of war in Europe and Asia shattered Brazil's isolation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, fearing the consequences if Brazil supported Germany, Italy, and Japan, created a Cultural Exchange Bureau, the Office of Inter-American Affairs, the OIAA. Nelson A. Rockefeller was named director of the OIAA and gladly volunteered to serve as a $1-a-year man. Rockefeller knew Latin America and its politics, having frequented that part of the world overseeing his family's enterprises and forging artistic ties on behalf of New York's Museum of Modern Art. To counter Nazi lies and propaganda, the United States State Department sought to promote the democratic way of life and to help bring together the peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt and his military intelligence officers needed to assess the extent of Nazi influence amidst intellectuals and the level of Axis sympathy among German, Italian, and Japanese immigrant groups. The agency also wanted to enlist influential Brazilians in the Allied wartime effort. By 1942, however, the war was beginning to turn in favor of the Allies. The Nazi threat to the hemisphere had lessened, and Nazi defeats in Africa, coupled with constant pressure from Roosevelt, persuaded Vargas to bring Brazil into the war. But Vargas's decision did not end the OIAA's operation, which had in 2 short years moved into high gear. Beginning in the summer of 1940, the OIAA assembled a core group of artists and scholars and sent these cultural emissaries to Latin America. Rockefeller, familiar with the New Deal programs that had documented American life during the late 1930s, also hired 3 photographers to join his diplomatic mission. This documentary explores the work of one of them, Genevieve Naylor. Naylor began her career as a photojournalist for the Associated Press in 1937 and was selected by the Office of Inter-American Affairs to pictorially document Brazilian life and culture. In October of 1940, Naylor and her husband, painter Peter Reznikoff, another OIAA employee, settled in Rio de Janeiro and began their 2-year, 9-month journey through Brazil. Her surviving archive of more than 1,300 photographs remarkably document Brazilian society in the early 1940s. Genevieve Naylor was born in 1915 in Springfield, Massachusetts. While a student at Miss Hall's school in Pittsfield, Naylor began studying painting with a teacher who first became her mentor, then her husband, Peter Reznikoff, an émigré from Ukraine and graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design. Naylor went on to study painting from 1933 to 1935 at the Art Students League in New York. Inspired by the work of filmmakers Sergei Eisenstein and Robert Flaherty, and the photographers Eugene Adjei and André Cartier-Bresson, Naylor decided to change her career direction and in 1935 began a lifetime professional relationship with Bernice Abbott, first as her photography student at New York's New School for Social Research, then as her apprentice. Peter Reznikoff, who had moved to New York in 1930, established himself as a Works Progress Administration painter and muralist, and won a commission to paint the walls of Rockefeller Center. In 1937, just 22 years old, Naylor was hired by the Works Progress Administration to photograph the people of Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and urban workers in New York City. Naylor continued her photojournalism career with time and fortune. One of the first women hired as a photojournalist by an American wire service, she covered human interest stories for the feature service of Associated Press. In addition, she was selected to chronicle the Harlem Art Center as part of the Harlem Document Project. Naylor arrived in Brazil at a time when the DIP, Vargas's Information and Propaganda Ministry, controlled the press and censored films, radio programs, and theater. Disembarking in Rio in October of 1940, with 2 cameras, a light meter, and a battered black wickered suitcase, she immediately encountered Brazil's exacting rules and regulations. In a letter to her sister, she wrote,
"My first striking visual sight was not the bustling energy of the Copacabana beach or the billboards and slums, but a solitary young Negro girl sitting cross-legged in the center of a street intensely focused on constructing a wooden flute. If there ever was a moment to have my camera, unfortunately the Brazilian authorities have confiscated my equipment while they scrutinize my background to make sure I'm not some fifth-column subversive."
The OIAA asked Naylor not to produce controversial images. Vargas's propaganda agency was even more restrictive. DIP officials issued guidelines to Naylor that limited her picture-taking to safe picture postcard subjects. She could only photograph labor unionists as long as workers were captured in an orderly and obedient manner. As far as the OIAA was concerned, Naylor's photographs were part of its wartime mission to win sympathy among Brazilians for the Allied cause, and to show the American public that the Allies could count on the Brazilians should the Axis powers attack the Western Hemisphere. For Naylor, this meant using her camera to focus on what was truly distinctive and authentic about Brazil. But in addition to the restrictions from the Vargas's propaganda ministry, she faced other obstacles. She wrote,
"Film is being rationed to everyone. I don't have the luxury of shooting anything I want. I have to be damn careful and choose my images with great care and hope my exposures are correct. What helps is the absolute cooperation of the Brazilians. They're so natural in their demeanor, so giving and warm. My camera just loves them."
Naylor's photographs emphasize everyday scenes and ordinary people, a portraiture her hosts felt ambivalent about. Brazil's government tiptoed around the matter of interracial contact, avoiding any insinuation that blacks and browns were less favored. This, despite the fact that most impoverished residents in the interior, as well as in the working-class districts, were mixed-race descendants of Africans imported to Brazil as slaves from the early 1500s. Photographers hired by the DIP depicted all classes of Brazilians, as long as they seemed happy and reflected the values the dictatorship wanted to show the outside world. Naylor simply shot what she found visually informative to fulfill the OIAA's requirement. And because she chose to feature members of the lower classes, her photographic portfolio yielded a higher proportion of racially mixed Brazilians. Because Rio was strictly segregated residentially, with affluent whites living in upper-class neighborhoods, and the city's majority population of blacks and mulattoes living in hillside shantytowns, Naylor delighted in juxtaposing images of rich, poor, and working-class people against the backdrop of modern life, material progress, and the city's extraordinary physical beauty. Brazilians of all kinds populate her photographs. Ice cream vendors carrying their wares on their heads, street photographers, young men playing soccer on the beach, and the undulating sound and pulse of Carnival illustrate Rio's city life. During their stay in Brazil, Reznikoff and Naylor lived in Leme, a section of the fashionable Zona Sul, which included Copacabana and Ipanema. Naylor enchanted her hosts.
"She's an adorable American girl,"
eulogized composer Vinicius de Moraes.
"Elegant, with a youthful air, always with a feather in her cap, like Robin Hood. Nothing escapes her camera."
Naylor's familiarity with Rio's back streets enabled her to assist newly arrived Americans affiliated with the OIAA. When Orson Welles chose Carnival as one of his 3 themes about Latin America for his film It's All True, he asked Naylor for advice.
Welles knew the Avenida Rio Branco and the Avenida Beira Mar were the 2 major Carnival parade routes, but he didn't know that in the Praça 11, a separate and almost exclusive Negro carnival is staged.
Carnival's eruption of color, sound, and rhythm attracted the attention of Welles, Naylor, and other foreigners, much to the chagrin of Brazilian elites, who resented Carnival for overshadowing Brazilian high culture. The Brazilian upper class shared the U.S. State Department's view that Brazil's natural wonders, its handsome architecture, new factories, and public works projects built under the auspices of Vargas's government were more appropriate than photographs of penitents, black carnival dancers, or rural peasants in ragged clothing. Nevertheless, Brazilian intellectuals genuinely applauded Naylor and praised her efforts in Brazil's major newspapers. There was gratifying praise for Reznikoff's work as well. Hired by the OIAA to befriend fellow Brazilian artists, lecture, and exhibit his art, Reznikoff developed and composed a series of anti-fascist expressionistic paintings entitled Monsters of War. Evocative of Picasso's Guernica, the work went on exhibition in December 1941 at Rio's Fine Arts Museum. The OIAA, despite denials, sometimes encouraged employees to engage in low-level espionage and to report any fascist activities. Reznikoff paid a penalty for this. Suspected of spying, he was, according to his son Peter, so severely beaten by Vargas's secret police that for several hours after the assault, he lost the ability to speak English and could only mumble words in Russian. Brazil's population had more than doubled since its last national census in 1920. There were now 41 million people living in the country. Most dwelled not in the rural countryside, but in cities and towns. Brazil's major cities were the primary residences for affluent families. To document this booming urban growth, Naylor headed south to São Paulo in January of 1942. Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo were very different places. Over the decades, São Paulo attracted not only mixed-race immigrants from the rural interior, but large numbers of European immigrants, principally Italians, Spaniards, Portuguese, and Japanese. Authorities in both cities resorted to razing neighborhoods to build thoroughfares, forcing inhabitants to relocate. Many working-class families ended up living in crowded tenements carved out of old buildings and factories in outlying zones near railroad depots and shipping docks. Seeking to further capture the texture of the lives of ordinary Brazilians in these towns and cities, Naylor and Reznikoff left Rio in February 1942, crisscrossing the interior and east coast of Brazil and traveling as far north as Belém, Recife, the inner reaches of the San Francisco River, the state of Bahia, and the western region of Minas Gerais. It took 20 days to reach the Amazon from Rio, and 12 days from Rio to get to the gold region of Minas Gerais by way of the San Francisco River. All Naylor had at her disposal was a Rolleiflex and a speed graphic camera, natural light, and an artist's intuition. Naylor's trip up the San Francisco River in 1942 captured aspects of Brazilian life virtually undocumented by conventional sources. For hundreds of years, until roads were built after the late 1940s, the river provided the chief means of transporting passengers, cargo, and animals to the northeastern coast. The riverboats were difficult to navigate. There were no navigational aids to warn pilots of shifting river conditions. Here, fishermen, with the aid of long wooden poles, helped dislodge a riverboat stuck in a mud bank. The riverboats also stopped at towns where victims of the region's periodic droughts had come to beg for food and work. Vargas's legislative benefits rarely reached such distant places. Rural farmers kept themselves barely a step above the peasantry by toiling as farm laborers or renters in various sharecropping arrangements, which left them without hope of acquiring land. Brazilians photographed by Naylor in the interior of the country covered a broad composite of different subjects: gold miners and Indians from the mouth of the Amazon, farmers, often dressed in their best attire, wearing hats, while the women appeared in dresses and stockings. Naylor's series of Catholic penitents, elaborate processionals, and church festivals in the Baroque colonial city of Congonhas in Minas Gerais documents the power of religion in the region. Century artwork created by the mulatto Antonio Francisco Lisboa, known as Ale Jorginho, Dominic Congonhas. Crippled by leprosy, he sculpted these magnificent religious figures with chiseling instruments attached to the stump of his arms. What do Naylor's photographs tell us about Brazil? Since her mission was to educate and inform American audiences about their Brazilian allies and good neighbors, her photographs were neither photojournalistic in the tradition of Jacob Riis or Walker Evans, nor propagandistic in the mold of Vargas's DIP. Her perspective on Brazil rests in the way she portrayed the diversity of a complex society with propriety and respect. Because she refused to manipulate the viewer, she allowed observers to peer beneath the surface of mere picture-taking to discover something more important. Here, the depiction of men and boys in hats standing before another anti-leprosy poster calls attention without sentimentality to the Vargas public health campaign. This kind of image conveys what critic Vicky Goldberg terms the quiet humanity of observation and a basic trust in the worth of ordinary people. For this reason, she never emphasized poverty for itself. She couldn't. Had she sought to capture the squalor of social injustice, she would have been deported. Naylor's photo reportage technique was influenced by 4 film directors. The composition of this hammock shot, taken on a San Francisco riverboat, shows Naylor's debt to Sergei Eisenstein's battleship Potemkin. These low-angle shots show the influence of John Ford and D.W. Griffith, and especially Robert Flaherty's film, Man of Arran. Her use of low camera angles in these Copacabana shots emphasized not only the handsome mosaic sidewalk tiles that symbolizes Rio's seaside personality, but the humorous juxtapositions of the overdressed couple walking under an umbrella and the young men lounging in bathing trunks on the benches. Through her selection of one camera angle, the details of a scene become both a record of everyday life and an abstract grouping of multi-ornamental figures framed against an environmental canvas. An example of this resides within this unusual photograph taken on the banks of the San Francisco River. The 3 mounted figures dominate the scene, framed by a thatched structure on which hangs a hollow gourd, a vessel for water, so necessary in this parched climate. The men are caboclos, cattle tenders, clothed from head to foot in leather, just like their forebears. One rider poses wearily, as if he senses the artificiality of the occasion. Yet the photograph's composition discloses something else. Notice the mangy, emaciated backlands dogs at the feet of the horses. One lies exhausted on the ground near the man seated in the shade, nattily dressed in white shoes, holding an egg, with 4 more at his feet. The juxtaposition of the present and the past, of men dressed in the words of Euclides da Cunha, as some medieval knight transported to modern times, alongside a man dressed for walking along Rio's Copacabana beach, captures hauntingly the dual character of Brazil, historically divided between the backlands and the seacoast, between elites conscious of their modernity and the backlanders whom the upper classes considered as atavistic and primitive. In one striking photograph, Naylor catches a subtle but humorous insight into Brazil's rigid 2-class structure. Ordinary people went directly to officials to get things done, such as taking care of a hospital bill, or obtaining a job, or getting out of military service. This is demonstrated brilliantly by Naylor's photograph of a municipal waiting room, in which patient supplicants wait for their chance to ask for favors, sitting under the gaze of a photographic gallery of former mayors. Government propaganda emphasized Brazil's industrial gains, which were real. Yet as much as half of the population eked out a living in the informal sector. This peddler is selling brooms made by hand. Here is a portrait of a man sitting on a corner repairing a hole in a pail. This young boy is a shoe cobbler at a workbench. During the 1940s, many children worked full-time, despite laws restricting such employment. Residents in the interior of Minas Gerais gather at their doors and window to watch the street. Although we see wires bringing electricity to the houses in this prosperous center-south area of the city, the scene is timeless and shows Brazil's modernization drive under the Vargas regime. Naylor caught scenes from everyday life that reveal a wealth of detail about dress, physical presence, and stereotypes. Here, 2 Afro-Brazilian women converse on the street in the coastal city of Salvador. They are elegantly dressed. One wears high-button shoes, a rarity for most Brazilians. They appear affluent, in contrast to the conventional preconception that Brazilian blacks were all poor. Naylor's artistic vision was ultimately honored in America. In January of 1943, New York's Museum of Modern Art mounted Naylor's Brazilian work, Faces and Places in Brazil. Her show was a rarity for the time. Few women commanded single exhibitions. Alfred Barr, MoMA's curator and founding director, lauded the 28-year-old's work as remarkable and outstanding. In 1944, the museum sent Faces and Places in Brazil on tour across the United States. Naylor's show caught the attention of Alexei Brodovich, Harper's Bazaar's art director. In 1943, 5 months after Naylor's return from Brazil, she joined a core group of other photographers, including Richard Avedon, and launched a fashion and reportage career that lasted into the late 1970s. Because of the restrictive hand of the DIP, very few photographs of Brazil in the early 1940s, except for Naylor's, are available to us. Naylor's incursions into the little-known corners of Brazil that had been ignored up until then created an important archive unlike any other. Naylor's challenge was to represent reality in ways that sold the American public on Brazil's reliability without alienating the Brazilian dictatorship. Unlike Sebastião Salgado a generation later, Naylor had to avoid evoking images of injustice while still portraying the conditions under which many Brazilians lived. Nevertheless, just as Dorothea Lange chronicled the catastrophic conditions facing Americans during the Depression, Naylor showed us a stoic people battling the odds. The significance of her work lies in the way she captured Brazilians in ways that illuminated the small victories of everyday life. Never showing futility or downright urban misery, which would have countered the spirit of her OIAA assignment, Naylor's artistry produced a series of far more detailed images of Brazilian life than the American public had ever seen before.